Give us the joy of your saving help again, and sustain us with your bountiful Spirit. Please be seated. It's the 5th Sunday in Lent. Next week, we will begin our march into Holy Week, and I don't know about you, but I'm starting to realize that I am running out of time to achieve whatever gains of spiritual value I want from my Lenten practice. To be honest, it's been a little haphazard this year. In past years, I have spent time in Lent engaged in study, or I have attempted daily prayer, and sometimes I have wandered in a wilderness of uncertainty, doubtful that God's love could really be meant for me. In recent years, I have begun to wonder if God is ever disturbed by the spiritual contortions I inflict upon myself in Lent. So this year, given all the various pressures of my life, I have tried to practice a joyful Lent. I'm not very good at it. And this week, as I have been meditating on our lectionary readings, I have found it especially difficult. So I hope that you will indulge me as I work through some of the challenges in the readings before us and try to find some joy. This morning's gospel selection is a little chaotic. We're picking up with Jesus and the crowds of people who have followed him in the aftermath of the raising of Lazarus and have accompanied his triumphant, palm-strewn entry into Jerusalem. Some Greek fellows ask to see Jesus, and he answers their curiosity with a rather strange speech and a parable about a grain of wheat that must die in one form in order to fulfill its potential and bear fruit. After some cryptic words about life and death, and after he charges his disciples and these Greek people that he has just met to follow him, Jesus shares some of his all too human worries and fears about the time to come. But he keeps the stakes at the forefront. Like the seed that needs to germinate in the earth, to shed its outer layer and transform into a plant that can grow and flourish, Jesus has some hard, transformative days ahead of him. And why? So that in being lifted up from the earth, both on the cross and later in the resurrection and ascension, he can draw all people to himself. In his sacrifice, yes, but especially in transcending that sacrifice, Christ draws all of us into the fold, bringing the whole world within reach of God's love. These are the stakes, the potential, nourishing, life-sustaining fruit that can grow out of God's redeeming work, and Jesus' steadfast focus on that goal, which the author of the letter to the Hebrews calls obedience. Our reading from this letter to the Hebrews fits thematically with the gospel lesson, but it is challenging because a lot of bad theologies have grown out of the idea that Jesus achieved a state of perfection through his obedience to suffering. It's not uncommon to hear people talk about suffering in their own life as a thing they must endure. Because Jesus suffered, and through that suffering, maybe they can better know Jesus. The worst version of this theology shows up when we are unable to have compassion for another person's suffering, either because we believe some good will come out of it, or we believe that suffering is just part of this life, and therefore, we don't need to strain ourselves toward empathy. Jesus did suffer, of course, but I tend to think that his suffering was primarily rooted in empathy. He grieved for the young man caught up in the chains of his own wealth and position. He was moved by compassion and empathy whenever confronted by a person in any amount of pain. And in his passion and death, he willingly endured the violence of political systems, like many people before him. Maybe that's what it means to achieve perfection through suffering. So, what does perfection mean in this context? We can define the word as ideal, or flawless, or exemplary. These are entirely subjective concepts. And what is ideal to one culture is not going to be so to another. We can attempt to view Christ's perfection through the lens of his culture, but the results are somewhat counterintuitive. Was Christ perfect because he followed all the laws and observed all the rituals? I think we can all agree that he was not. The man who acknowledged the humanity of his women followers, of the woman by the well, and of the unclean woman who touched his cloak, certainly did not obey the laws of his culture. The man who healed the sick on the Sabbath, pitched a fit in the temple, and dined with tax collectors was not an exemplar of his time and place. But here we are looking at Christ's actions through a terribly human lens. We are asking if he did everything correctly. We're asking if he obeyed human laws. If we take a wider view and switch lenses, perhaps, and ask if Christ was a perfect example of God's love, we get a much different answer. The man who acknowledged the humanity of his women followers, who talked and listened to the woman at the well, and who healed the supposedly unclean woman, that man is a good example of love in action. The man who acted with compassion, who was angered by corruption and greed, who was not blinded by the prejudices of caste, is an exemplar of God's wondrous love. And that love has complete, we might even say perfect, manifestation in Christ's sacrifice on the cross. In one of my classes last semester, I got to read a chapter from Kelly Brown Douglas's book, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies and the Justice of God. I would like eventually to read the whole book, but I'm going to need some time, which is in short supply. In that chapter, Douglas talks about the importance of the cross to a theology of solidarity. She argues that Jesus, throughout his public ministry, demonstrated a determination to set aside his privilege and instead willingly engage on equal footing with people on the margins, people who did not benefit from political power. In persisting in this solidarity with the marginalized bodies of his day, Jesus conflicted with the systems of power, the Roman Empire and the Jewish temple elites. And his political death was inevitable. In submitting to the indignity of the cross, Jesus entered into solidarity with the crucified class of people. And in his resurrection, Jesus demonstrates the free, life-affirming power of God's love. Douglas writes, "The cross they erected to destroy Jesus epitomizes human opposition to all that God stands for as one who gives life. The cross represents the power that denigrates human bodies, destroys life, and preys on the most vulnerable in society. As the cross is defeated, so too is that power. The impressive factor is how it is defeated. It is defeated by a life-giving rather than a life-negating force. God's power respects, that's what that word is, respects the integrity of all human bodies and the sanctity of all life. This is a resurrecting power Therefore, God's power never expresses itself through the humiliation or denigration of another. It does not triumph over life. It conquers death by resurrecting life. The force of God is a death-negating, life-affirming force. It's a real good book, I imagine. That chapter, though, amazing. Now, it may seem strange to talk about resurrection on the fifth Sunday in Lent, but even in Lent, even a week away from Palm Sunday and the measured walk of Holy Week, it is good to remember that ours is a faith of resurrection, that the joy of Easter is present with us, dwelling within us always, celebrated every single Sunday when we celebrate the Eucharist. That good news is as much a part of the season of Lent as all the penitence we can muster. A season of penitence can bring about a change in our hearts and renew our relationship with God so that we can rejoice in God's saving help. But regardless of anything we might do or not during this or any season, God has already written God's law on our hearts and declared us as God's own people. The God we follow, the God we know, doesn't let anything get in the way of love. Doesn't let anything get in the way of God's salvific plan for all creation to enjoy full, free, abundant life. And that is some joyful, good news.